So I have a pet peeve about the term codependent. When people use that to describe victims of abuse or to describe the behaviors that people do when they're experiencing toxic relationships. I get that it's an easy umbrella to put these behaviors under as a way to describe them, to teach about them, but I find this particular term misleading, confusing, and even harmful at times. So to be clear, this video is not meant to negate the very real psychological things that are happening for people that the term codependent is used for. My issue is just that term, like that particular word we're using to describe these very real things that people are experiencing. So today I'm going to dive deep into the history of this term, codependency, where it came from, and I'm going to tell you why I personally will never use this. If you find the codependent label helpful, use it. I've got no issue with that. But if you've heard of it and it hasn't quite resonated or it's left you feeling a little bit confused, keep watching. So first, to start out with, codependency, it's not an official diagnosis. You won't go to the psychiatrist or your therapist and they'll diagnose you with codependency. It doesn't work like that. It's a behavioral theory, which is something that people use to explain human behavior. So this term first came about to describe the dynamics of alcoholism. Alcoholics Anonymous in particular were studying the effects of alcoholism on a family, on the family dynamics. And what they realized was the family and friends of the person who was addicted to alcohol was getting involved and actually hindering their recovery by doing things like paying for them so they didn't have to get a job. It's what we would call enabling. So Alcoholics Anonymous called these family members that were enabling codependents. So here's where I'm going to start to rant a little bit. So this somewhat makes sense, a little bit, but actually to me and my logic, it doesn't completely make sense. Because the term co, the prefix co, means together, jointly, with. So to me, the way the term codependent makes sense to me and my logic is that if you were truly a codependent, that would mean that the partner, let's say, for example, of an alcoholic, would also be dependent on alcohol. Codependent, they would both be dependent together. And that's not typically how this term is used. It's used to describe the partner of someone who is an alcoholic, not someone who is also dependent on a substance themselves. So then, in the mid-1980s, the self-help world then co-opted this term and started using it to describe other types of dysfunctional relationship dynamics beyond the original use of the term with alcoholics. There were people who were using the term codependent to describe the addictive dynamics of toxic and abusive relationships, which the addictions are very real, which again to me technically doesn't make sense because if this person were an addict, we naturally would be calling them another addict, not a codependent, not this other thing that is not an addict but a codependent. So again, confusing, right? So this is really where the term loses me. Logically, it's not adding up. In 1986, Melanie Beattie wrote the book Codependent No More. Super popular book, sold a ton of copies, and this really made the term popular beyond the Alcoholics Anonymous world. Melody herself was an alcoholic and a drug addict. She got into relationships with other addicts and alcoholics and saw how it affected her. She described it as codependent. So she was not a clinician and researcher, and this is important to note. I first heard of this term in the context of toxic and abusive relationships when I was coming out of my abusive relationship, and I was trying to figure out what the heck happened, how did I end up here, and I saw people using this term codependent over and over again. First, it didn't make sense to me, and so I tried to figure out what is this? Like, what is codependence? Why are people saying this? I thought this was originally supposed to be used for the alcoholic dynamics. The more I read about it, the more I realized that something about this just felt off relating to my experience. It didn't feel like this term was hitting the nail on the head, so to speak, for what I was going through. So as I was researching, again, it's not an official diagnosis. Codependency is not even in the DSM manual, which is the book that therapists, psychiatrists use to make an official diagnosis. There is no clear consensus on what codependency means. So here's some general things that I found in my research that people are describing as codependency, and I'm going to read these off for you guys. Assuming responsibility for meeting others' needs to the exclusion of acknowledging one's own. Enmeshment in relationships with people who have personality disorders or additions. And I'm not even really sure what that means, but really what we're talking about enmeshment here, enmeshment means poor boundaries or an over concern for others. And enmeshment is a real thing. So another characteristic of codependency that I've seen out there is wanting to please everyone, having a lot of people-pleasing behaviors, a need to fix or help other people. The person's sense of purpose is based on making extreme sacrifices to satisfy their partner's needs and mental, emotional, or physical reliance on a friend or family member. The last definition there is really why I take issue with this term, codependency, because there is nothing wrong with depending on the people in your life. So I feel like the term codependence is pathologizing all dependence, which is not true. Again, it's not unhealthy to depend on other people. It's healthy to be interdependent and to rely on others. None of us can get through this life completely isolated and by ourselves. Not even the most advanced spiritual practitioners. They still talk to people. They still need others to get their basic needs met. If dependence on others was codependence, then all of us would be codependent. So some people will argue, and they will probably argue in the comments, and they might say, well, Lindsay, no, codependence is only when these behaviors, these dependencies are taken to the extreme. Like when it becomes to the point where you sacrifice yourself for someone else. Which, okay, I hear that. But just the idea that some types of dependence are unhealthy doesn't sit well with me. Because very often when we hear that some dependency isn't okay, like when it's to the extreme, then subconsciously we tend to equate all dependency with being unhealthy. Now again, this probably isn't happening for most of you consciously, but subconsciously we can then start to judge dependency, all dependency, as bad. It can cause us to judge ourselves for our own dependency on others, our own healthy interdependence. And this is one of the things that bugs me, because in an authentic healing journey, we need to accept the reality that we are dependent on each other, not to judge ourselves for it. In spiritual circles, we would call this spiritual bypassing, the tendency to just not see something, pretend something is not there, push it away. And that is the opposite of what we need to do in order to truly heal. We would say we are bypassing our authentic and very real dependence on others. And when we bypass, we're not actually healing. We're just pushing it down. It just goes into the subconscious. It's not really gone. So really that's the reason, one of the main reasons why I don't like this term is because we have a tendency to, again, judge any type of dependency as not ideal. And the main goal of healing is to be completely free of any dependency. If you've been in spiritual circles, you know that this idea is promoted a lot. So some of the other behaviors that people are describing when they're using the term codependence, yeah, they are not ideal. But I don't think we need to label it as this term codependence. We can just say that people-pleasing is a maladaptive behavior and we can work to shift it. I don't think we need to put this label on it. I also don't like this label, codependence, because it's often given to people coming out of abusive relationships. And if you've been in an abusive relationship, you probably know that the last thing that you need is somebody telling you that there's something wrong with you. The last thing you need is a label that pathologizes your normal responses to abuse. If you've been in an abusive relationship, you've been made to feel like there is something wrong with you, like you're always the problem, like you are always to blame. And when people slap that codependent label on you, it can just feel like a continuation of the abuse. What victims need to truly heal and recover is to take the blame off of themselves, to understand that there isn't something wrong with them, that they're responding the way anyone would when exposed to chronic mistreatment. So this is especially why I don't like using this term, and why I won't ever use this term to describe someone coming out of a toxic or an abusive relationship, because I really don't think it's helpful, and in a lot of cases it can make someone feel worse. It can be harmful, because what they really need most is to feel like there's not something wrong with them, to feel like they're normal, to negate everything that their abuser told them. Now, there is a term that does make sense to me, and that's dependent personality disorder. This is in the DSM. So this is meant to describe a very passive personality, someone who's in a lot of denial, who relies excessively on other people for help. It's a lifetime pattern of dependent behavior. It's like an excessive need to be taken care of. And this is not the type of thing that most people who are labeled as codependent are experiencing, like an abuse victim, for example. But I wanted to point out that there is this thing called dependent personality disorder, and it is a very real thing. So you might be asking, well, Lindsay, is there another term that you could get behind to describe these behavioral characteristics? And the answer is yes. If they made up another term that made sense for these behaviors, then yeah, I would get behind it. Like, for example, Ross Rosenberg, who is a psychologist, uses the term self-love deficit disorder. That makes sense to me. That works with my logic, because these behaviors, like staying in an abusive relationship, they are due to a lack of self-love. And improving self-love is what shifts those behaviors. Getting to the point where you love yourself enough that you aren't staying in these relationships too long, that you value your own feelings enough to not stay where you're mistreated. That's what shifts this. So I would definitely be on board with a term like that. But I want to hear from you guys. What term would make sense to you? Does the codependent term work for you? Would you rather it be called something else? Do you like the self-love deficit disorder? Let me know in the comments, I'm curious. Speaking of self-love, if you want to learn more about how to love yourself after a toxic relationship, click here and click here to subscribe. I come out with new videos every week on healing from toxic relationships and finding real healthy love. You can also follow me on Instagram at Living Free Finding Love for daily updates.